You, of course, your phone is inoperable. How did you get? And you were going to spend the night unexpectedly at Zealand.
Yes.
How did you get word to Kathy that you were okay?
Well, I got to the Zealand hut. It was about 5 o'clock. So it was pitch dark. Just about the time I opened the door, I immediately told everybody that I was in trouble. That I had got off track. And I needed to get in touch with my wife. It was one of the first things I told them, because she was going to be at home worrying.
Hello there, podcast listener. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Eat Half, Walk Double podcast, coming to you from the Ascend Endurance Coaching Studios here in frigid Stratford, New Hampshire, US of A. I'm your host, Chris Dunn. If you follow the show, well, thank you very much, and also welcome back. So this show chronicles my 4 decades in endurance sports. As an exercise physiologist, coach, race director, and athlete, told through the stories of the important, influential, and interesting people I've met along the way, while I catch up with friends, colleagues, rivals, clients, and the occasional family member. It's my hope you'll learn a little something about health, fitness, and the secrets to living well along the way. Ken Young is my guest this week. As outdoor adventure resumes go, he's in rarefied air. Literally. His first registered hike was Mount Washington and Mount Jefferson in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in June of 2000. 6 years later, he would stand atop the 14,411-foot Mount Rainier in Washington State. That trip kicked off a short but incredibly memorable mountaineering phase of his life that saw him climb some of the highest peaks in the world, including 4 of the 7 summits. In part 1 of this 2-part episode, we chat about why he got into the sport of hiking, his transition to mountaineering, and his experience on Mount McKinley in May of 2011, a tragic month that saw 7 climbers die. Well, here he is, Ken Young. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
It's good to see you, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing good. Real good.
Yeah, you and I we don't have the opportunity to cross paths much anymore. Seems to me that you're equally as busy as you were when you were still full-time at the restaurant, just in a different kind of busy, but staying busy nonetheless.
Oh yeah, I've got a greenhouse and I got a backyard, and I work out, and I have my mountains, and I have my wife, who is my biggest supporter in everything that I do, and I couldn't do anything without her, my wife, Kathy.
Yeah, no doubt. As you and I get to talking a little bit, while she may not specifically be mentioned in all of these stories, the truth is that it is because of Kathy that all of these stories had the opportunity to take place. Would you say that's true?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, she is my biggest supporter. I mean, she does it quietly, but all of a sudden, there'll be a time, and she really says one sentence, and you can tell that she supports me 110%. Does that mean she's not concerned? Yeah, she's always concerned when I go hiking, and because I've done a lot of hiking solo. She does worry a lot at home, but I try to do the best I can to ease that.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of those experiences. In fact, let's start this way. So, Recently, I read two books from author Ty Gagne, who I know you're familiar with. And the two books I'm sure you're very familiar with: The Last Traverse and Where You'll Find Me. Right,
Right.
those two books by Ty Gagne. And these two stories, for the listener who's not familiar with them, these two stories illustrate the dangers of winter hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. You recently had a fairly harrowing experience of your own in the White Mountains. You want to tell us about it?
Well, I think to start with on this, I think in anything that people do, there's always an opportunity for all of us to get a little bit complacent. That said, I try to keep my eye on that. And, when I put my pack together and go out for the day on a trek, I try to pack everything that I think I'm going to need. But the biggest thing all of us need, no matter what we do, is we need to be mentally prepared for anything that happens. And I've said all along, hiking for me, my business in a restaurant, I mean, you have to be mentally tough, mentally ready to do what any one of us does. I mean, Chris, you work out. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already understand yourself. The activities that you've gotten into, it's the same thing. If you can be physically ready for anything, but if you're not mentally ready, you're going to fail. So this trip, I had met some good friends at the Crawford Notch to climb. For me, it was going to climb Field and Wiley with those folks, and then start my bushwhack down to Westfield and Whitewall in the Call area in between those first two peaks. I had started climbing up with a group, and I kept looking at my watch, and some of those folks weren't as in shape, or they're just starting out hiking the 4,000 footers. It takes a long time to mentally get physically fit, mentally fit, and do these in a timely manner. So, I was up against the clock. So I eventually told a good friend of mine, Denise Stasis, that is a tremendous hiker in the Whites. She has a big resume. I said, "Hey, Denise, I got to move on." And she understood. So I took off on my own, saw them on the way back from Wiley, excuse me. And then I bushwhacked down towards Westfield. I'm going to guess, because I didn't measure this out before this studio appointment, but I would say Westfield was about a mile to from the Call area, and then I was going to bushwhack to Whitewall. Well, in the process, my apparatus that I use a lot, my phone, was getting wet. Bushwhacking, it was kind of warm that day, plus you're going through trees that have snow on them, and this is the mentally tough part. You got to deal with being wet and cold. It's not easy. A lot of work. You're in snow, heavy snow sometimes. And long story short, my phone went dead, and the battery just died on it. So I had to rely on my map and compass, which is great if you know where you are. And I basically, I'll say right off the top, the mistake I made in this whole story is that when I knew that I did not have my phone anymore, I should have taken everything off, my pack, taken my map out, taken my compass out, and just took 2, 3, 4 minutes and really make a solid decision. And that's the mistake I made. I didn't make a solid decision. I made the easy decision, which was, okay, I knew AZ Trail was in front of me. I'll just take a north bearing because I knew I'd run right into it. And instead of, I had other options, and I didn't think of them because I didn't take the time to think of them. So that is a lesson learned. So now I put my phone in a Ziploc bag to keep it dry. And also, look, when next time you have a issue like that, stop and think. Think everything out, all your options. So I started trekking towards the AZ trail. Well, the AZ portion that I was trekking to does not see a lot of winter use because it's on the other side of the Tom Field and Wiley range. People just don't go that way in the winter. I mean, they do, but it's very rare. And for me, we just had 2 storms. So long story short, again, I lost faith that I had already seen the trail and didn't realize it, and I'd gone by it. So what happens when you sense that? Well, I don't know where I am. You know, the AZ trail was going to solidify where I am, and it didn't happen. So now I'm losing faith. Okay.
And you're also losing daylight.
And I'm also losing daylight. Correct. I mean, I had a headlamp and stuff, but hey, listen, when you're on a bushwhack, the last thing, and I've talked to other people that bushwhack too, the last thing you want to do bushwhacking is be out there with a headlamp. Okay.
Agree.
All right. So, especially in the winter.
Also agree.
So, I really started to buckle down. I got to a certain point. I knew that also the trail, there was another trail. So I was heading north to the AZ. I knew another trail was more west as well. So I started leaning a little west as well, see if I could run into it there. And all of a sudden, I just I didn't panic. You know, panic is, there's no way I panicked. I think if I panicked, I wouldn't be here. But I just lost faith in, oh boy, where the heck am I? Where am I? I can't find AZ. I'm not running into that other trail. So I buckled down. I saw 2 pine trees that look like Christmas trees, if you will. And I said, you know, that's good. That is good protection from the deep cold. It'll hit the tree limbs first. I was going to cut some tree limbs off and make like a bed. I had a saw and stuff. I mean, I had a lighter. I don't know if I could have started a fire. One thing I learned too is I've got to get fire starters as well. Do a little study on that soon and get that in my pack as well. I mean, I'm not saying I couldn't start a fire because I had 2 lighting devices, but you just never know. Anyway, so I started rearranging my pack for staying out overnight.
And Ken, approximately, so of course this is January,
Mm-hmm.
and number of daylight hours are much shorter. Approximately what time in the afternoon was this? Was this after 3 p.m., after 4 p.m.?
No. When I started thinking about buckling down for the night, because remember, you need time to prepare yourself. I mean, you don't want to wait till it's pitch dark and it's real cold. Because I have been on a rescue, which you know, with your dad, Jim Dunn, many years ago. And let me tell you something: when you're in the woods at night, and now I think that was in February with your father. Unbelievable. I mean, we didn't get out of the woods till 1 a.m. I tell you, that was the coldest night I've ever been in the Whites. And it's just because you don't have any mobility. It's wintertime, and it's cold at elevation. It's just brutal. So all those things are going through my mind, Chris.
Right.
You know, 2 people just passed away up in Lafayette Ridge, and that was going through my mind like, oh my God, I'm going to be the 3rd one. That here the things that go through your mind when you're in a situation like this, you have no clue until you're in it. I mean, I had no clue until I was in it, and it wasn't good. So I went back. Once I got my pack ready, I looked at my watch, and go to your point. I'm sorry, I kind of went by what you were saying. I think, Chris, it was around 2:30 to 3. I had about an hour and a half to 2 hours of daylight. But, I'm still not knowing where I am. So I know that's going to take time. So I was preparing myself mentally. See, like I said, you can deal with anything if you're mentally prepared. And I did do that right. I mentally prepared myself to stay out overnight. It wouldn't have been the best. It may not have been a good decision, but mentally I was ready. Okay, and that's, to me, half the battle if you're gonna get through anything. So all of a sudden I looked at my watch. I said, geez, I still have a lot of time here. I can't just stay here. So I went to what I've always done when I've gotten in trouble in the past. And, I've been in trouble. This is little trouble, short term, few minutes, where you don't know if you're on a trail or not. And the rule is always follow your footsteps back until you know where you were. So that's what I started doing. And when I did that, I came into an opening. And because I was going in the opposite direction, I looked to my right, and there's Z Cliff. Thank the Lord, I said. I took out my map. I kind of looked and see. I knew that I was north of Z Cliff, northeast of Z Cliff. I estimated it. I saw the Zealand hut, which I knew was open. I took a bearing at 280, and I just took off. I think right there is I had an adrenaline rush like I probably never had in my life. And I just took off because I knew time was still of essence. And just because I saw Z Cliff, I still didn't know how far it was going to, or how long it was going to take me to get to my destination, which was safety.
Because you were still bushwhacking at this point.
Oh yeah. I'm in the middle of,
right.
I'm in the middle of the woods.
In the winter time, and so obviously that slows your rate of travel quite considerably.
Yeah, depending, yeah. I was in snow. Jesus, I'm trying to remember. I've done too many hikes since then, Chris. I think I was breaking down through the crust again. We've had a lot of warm weather, which makes it hard. When you break through a crust and then go into powder underneath, it's hard work to take each step. And so really the adrenaline kicked in for me, Chris. And you could probably help me a little bit better with this as I tell the story about the adrenaline piece, because you have physically, more about the body than I do. But so I eventually got down to Ethan Pond Trail, which then I knew exactly where I was. And I just, Chris, I'm an emotional guy. I was pretty close to tears
when you got to Ethan Pond Trail.
Yeah.
Because in that moment, did that generally equate to safety and more importantly, your ability to get out and get home?
Yes. So, and what I meant by the adrenaline rush is that all of a sudden, once I realized that I thought I'd be okay, adrenaline starts to seep out, right? And then I started cramping. It was unbelievable. My body just started cramping. So I was still in trouble. I still had to get to the Zealand hut. So I did stop. I drank as much as I could. I think actually I might have eaten a bar as well. I took my pack off and everything. I did stop for 2 or 3 minutes. My stops are fast. They always are. I do everything I'm supposed to do, 2 or 3 minutes, and I'm off and going. But it was tough going. It was slow because, I'd go 10, 20 feet, and I was breaking through the snow, and it All of a sudden, I start cramping a little bit. Now you got to erect your leg, to try to stretch that, hamstring or whatever, calf or whatever's cramping at the time. And then I got onto the main trail up to the Zealand Hut. And it's like 0.3 miles from that junction, but you got to go up 400 feet. It was like, that was the hardest 400 feet I think I've done in a long time, just because I was spent, I was emotional, I was cramping. It was pretty enlightening experience. And as much as I'm disappointed in how I performed that day, and knowing that I've always preached to never get yourself into that situation. But at the end of the day, a good friend of mine, Denise Stassis, again, she told me, Kenny, your experience is what got you to the Zealand Hut. So yeah.
When you, of course, your phone is inoperable. How did you get? And you were going to spend the night unexpectedly at Zealand.
Yes.
How did you get word to Kathy that you were okay?
Well, I got to the Zealand Hut. It was about 5 o'clock. So it was pitch dark. Just about the time I opened the door, I immediately told everybody that I was in trouble. That I had got off track. And I needed to get in touch with my wife. It was one of the first things I told them, because she was going to be at home worrying. And thank God that he had a call. They have those, you might be able to help me with this, Chris, stat phones, satellite phones.
Yeah, sat phone.
And so they can only call at a certain time. And I think his time was 7 a.m. and 5 o'clock at night. And I got there just before 5. So I gave him my wife's information, and that information went to Pinkham Notch, and people at Pinkham got a hold of my wife to let her know that I was okay. It was a tough night, for sure.
Was there ever a moment when you finally made it to Ethan Pond Trail and you knew exactly where you were? Was there ever a moment that crossed your mind that you were going to attempt to hike out? Or at that point, were you 100% you were going to have to, you needed to get to the hut?
I needed to stay at the hut. There's no way I don't think I had it in me. I think the adrenaline rush for 2 hours or so just burned my body. And plus, I've been out there since 8 o'clock in the morning.
But wow, two faithful or fateful, either way, either faithful or fateful, two fateful decisions that ultimately resulted in you being okay. One was to double back, and in doubling back, you spotted Seacliff and knew that you had a safety. The other fateful decision was once you knew you were found, in other words, you were on Ethan Pond Trail, the decision not to attempt to hike out, but to get to shelter. I mean, don't you believe that those two decisions, played a big part in you being able to make it home?
Wow, the decision also to carry a map and a compass.
Well, for sure. And we're going to talk. Of course, we're going to be talking much more about your most current endeavor, bushwhacking, which is very much a heavy map and compass activity. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Wow. What an amazing story. And, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, this story really highlights, the perils of being in the whites in the wintertime. I mean, truth is, you got yourself in a predicament below tree line. I mean, a lot of the times we think about, the extraordinary dangers of winter hiking above tree line, but truth is that you can get yourself in a bind even below tree line.
I was at 3,100 feet.
Yeah.
When all that stuff happened.
Right. In other words, the margin is really thin in the wintertime. And I know, and obviously I know that you know that, but for the listener to understand that.
Well, Alan Bernier that taught me how to bushwhack told me the margin of error in bushwhacking in the winter is zero. Yeah. It's zero. I mean, because you are in, it's one thing to be on a trail because the chances of being found quickly or other people being there to help you if, say, you got an injury and, halfway through your hike, it's a good opportunity somebody else might be on the trail. But when you're bushwhacking, and I don't care if there's 2 people or 3 people. If somebody's injured or something, it's going to be a problem for all 3 to be out overnight.
Yeah, no doubt. And particularly if your phone becomes inoperable as a bushwhacker, I mean, by definition, you are off trail, which suggests that if you need to be located, you become even more difficult to locate, the proverbial needle in a haystack.
Well, that's one reason why, Chris, my wife had the itinerary, of my hike. That's one reason why I backtracked, that they would find me sooner because I would be heading towards one of those peaks that I was going for. They would have been able to see my snowshoe tracks.
Yeah.
So and that was one reason why I backtracked.
Just quick follow-up. You do not use one of those spot trackers, one of those little satellite trackers, beacons that you put on your person.
I have a Garmin Mini 2.
All right. And is that a locator? Is that a personal?
That's
locator?
A Garmin. It's a satellite. It's used. It's with satellite capability. That you have an SOS that you can send out. In fact, Chris, it was brand new. It's basically new. I had it with me, and I hit the SOS button about 4 times, but I didn't know how to use it right. Thank God, because you have to lift the thing up and then press the button. And I found that out after, which is kind of good because I would have had all kinds of people out looking for me.
And that's one of those personal locator beacons that is a one-way signal. In other words, you can only send the signal out. You can't get a message back from Kathy or whoever. Correct? It's a one-way communication.
I can send a message.
Yes, you can send a message out, but you can't receive a message through the device. Okay, got it. So again, that's a really interesting part to the story. You had one of them, but you hadn't had it for very long.
No,
and so,
it was almost brand new. I really didn't know how to use it.
Yeah,
which is not good. I'm a preacher of, I don't care what you carry for equipment, but make sure you know how to use it. And lesson learned, right, Chris?
Yeah. It's really an amazing story. So Ken, for the listener who doesn't know Ken Young, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Well, I'm 65 years old. I was born in Gornick, lived in Dover all my life. I still live in Dover, New Hampshire. I went through the Dover school system, played football. That's where I met your father, Jim Dunn. He has been my mentor since high school days. There's a lot of people that in my life that have impacted me, but I don't know if there's anybody that's impacted me as much as your father. In a lot of different, for a lot of different reasons. First of all, your dad was a teacher, and I don't think he's ever lost that teacher mentality, old school, if you will. When he asks questions of you, he's really asking. Well, no, he's really trying to. His question is formed in such a way to make you think. And that's the teacher mentality that he has. And he still has it today. And I have so much respect for him. So anyway, so I started playing football because all this hiking thing is kind of got threads to gym. So I got out of, I went to postgraduate school at Bridgeton Academy after high school. Played football, a season of football there. Went to UNH, got a degree in culinary arts. From there, my dad owned a restaurant, and I started working there full time. And in 1990, my dad retired. My wife and I bought the business, and I started hiking in 2000 because of your dad. I met him in the gym again, the original Planet Fitness downtown Dover.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If anybody can still remember that. I've had a great life. Have had a lot of, I think the reason behind that is because I've been lucky to have been surrounded by such, good people, and your dad is one of them. And so I'm blessed that way. And I'm blessed with my wife and my family. And my mom and dad were great. Kathy's mom and dad were great. So we're very lucky. And
you sold the restaurant, Young's Restaurant, for anyone who's curious.
I haven't sold it. I went out of business because of COVID. And then we've rented the space out to Clark's Bistro.
Fair.
So,
yep.
Yeah.
Fair. Thank you for that clarification. Young's Restaurant, of course, in Durham, New Hampshire. And when so that you said COVID. So that what was that 2019, Ken, or 2020?
Oh God, Jesus, awful. Old news to me now.
I know.
Well, they closed us down on March 17th, whatever year that was. Was that 19 or 20?
Yeah. Okay.
And I kept watching the news every night, and I just looked at my wife, Kathy, and said, none of this is looking good, and it's not looking good for a long time.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the pandemic, and of course, restaurants were hit particularly hard.
Well, I was 63 and a half, and I, 6 or 8 weeks in, and again, all those close people that surround me that are good friends, I talked to every night. I had a friend of mine, Frankie Unen, is an absolute great friend. I talked to him almost every night, and there was a lot of tears, man, in those phone calls. He's in New Jersey, and he helped me a lot to get through the thought process of what I could and couldn't do, and he was there to listen, to begin with. And I don't mean to, Chris, you know how I am. I look, this. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that went through the same thing I did. So I don't like to talk about myself much. But for me, it was very emotional. I thought about my parents who were both passed, about the legacy of Young's Restaurant and what I should do. What's the right decision? Oh my God. I mean, it was so emotional for, when you think of life, it was a very, very short period of time, but, it was a tough time. But, when we made the decision to get out, I think it was, COVID really was a blessing in disguise at the end of the day for us. But at the time, making the decision was, unbelievably tough. But yeah, I'm glad I did it. Like a lot of decisions I've made in my life, you make them, you turn the page, and you move on.
Yeah. Well, and you, as I sort of mentioned in the open, you have most certainly kept yourself busy between your family, your greenhouse, and of course, your continued hiking passion. Let's talk about that. So your list of hiking related accomplishments is really quite extraordinary. Not only have you completed some of the most impressive local hiking feats like the New Hampshire 500, New England 67, New England 100, and something called the Grid, which we'll talk about in part 2 of this podcast, but you've also stood atop some of the highest peaks in the world. Your first registered, and you mentioned this, you referenced this earlier, your first registered hike was June 2nd, 2000.
Right.
And I asked you this question I'm going to ask you. I had asked you before, and it was funny when I asked you this question that I'm going to ask in a moment. I asked you, what do you remember about that hike? And you kind of laughed and you said, I don't remember much about it. So,
I thought about that though, Chris.
Okay. All right. So,
and I'm sure I went with your father.
Okay. Well, you did, and in fact, so when you told me you didn't remember much about that Washington Jefferson hike, I actually asked my dad. I said, "What do you remember about that hike?" So, so I got it from his perspective. So this will be funny. What do you? Because what he remembers about it and what you remember about it may be two different things. But what do you remember about that first hike?
Zero.
Okay. All
right. The only thing is, I think I thought about this though, Chris. I'm almost willing to bet that your father decided to do that hike with me, the first one, to make a huge statement on how awesome the mountains can be.
True.
Jefferson and Washington. I'm sure it wasn't raining. Okay. All right. Because I'm a fair weather guy. Okay. I don't try to get out there in bad weather too often. Okay. I have, but it's usually I didn't plan it that way. But I'm sure that Jim went on a bluebird day. But I get so blurred, Chris, because I've seen so many beautiful things on Washington and Jefferson over the years. Especially, I finished the Grid on Jefferson.
Yes.
And it was the most beautiful day I've ever had in the White Mountains. I couldn't have celebrated. And I did it solo like I did so many of my hikes. I had some people that wanted to join me, and I told them, you know what? I said, I've been doing most of this journey by myself. I said, I want to continue to do that. I know I had a huge celebration and screaming at the top of Jefferson, but it was the most beautiful day in April. Tons of snow, tons of blue sky, no wind. I had a T-shirt on. I was getting a sunburn. It was unbelievable.
Well, there's no doubt that he probably selected Washington and Jefferson as your first experiences in the Whites to not only show and demonstrate to you the beauty and the majesty of the White Mountains, but he probably also did it to teach you a little bit of a lesson about respect, specifically respecting the White Mountains. I mean, those are two of the more sort of prominent peaks in the White Mountains.
Jefferson's hard to get to, no matter what time of year.
No question. So when I asked him about it, I said, "What do you remember about Ken that day?"
Oh boy, here we go.
He laughed, and then he told this story. I can't recall, and I'm not sure. Well, he probably recalls. I can't recall exactly who else he said went that day, but there was a small party, maybe 3 or 4, and you were one of those. And what he said was, he said at some point Ken just took off, right? probably for any number of reasons. Summit fever is always a thing, right? Particularly for first time hikers, right? This urge and urgency to get to the summit. He said so. So Ken kind of took off. He said, and at some point, he got to a fork and he went right, but he was supposed to go left, and so he went right. All right, and by the time he made it to the ridge, and realized he had to cross the ridge back toward we were going, he said, I looked up and I could see him on the ridge, and he was going slowly in the same direction we were going, and at some point intersected my dad and the rest of your hiking crew.
Well, first of all, he's got the wrong story, but that's okay. But that is a story that is true. It's just the wrong hike. But he is right about that. That is a good learning experience. I did get ahead of that group. It was in the winter. I started in the summer, Chris. So just remember that. He is right about the winter hike going to Jefferson. I did get I'll be honest. I have to go back and look how many years in, 2 or 3, maybe 4 years in of my hiking career in the whites. And I was totally wrong. It was one of my first big learning lessons. And, I feel bad about this. And I've said this to your father. There was a gentleman that was with us that always hiked with Jim and stuff. He never hiked with Jim after that day. And I'll never forget that. I feel like I'm totally to blame for that, because he ripped me a new one at Edmund's Call going up to Jefferson when that happened. He ripped me one. And I didn't know him that well. He's a doctor out of Massachusetts. But at the end of the day, Chris, the guy was right. I was wrong. And I learned, you got to stay with your group, and you got to be a team. And no matter what happens, you work together and get to the summit. Or if the summit doesn't look good, you get together, you turn around and go to safety. So for me, that was a big learning experience. That's what I think Jim is talking about. Because if I remember right, we're on walkie-talkie. Say, hey, Kenny, because I was lost. And Kenny goes, hey, Kenny, just walk towards the sun. Just go towards the sun.
That's exactly.
So I'm on. Yeah,
and that's exactly the story he tells.
Yeah. So, but it wasn't the first hike though, Chris. He's got that wrong. Okay, brother. He just wanted to get that one in.
So Ken, why did we talked about sort of how you got started in hiking, but what was your why?
Well, because I was an athlete. And I was a physical athlete, if you will. I mean, I played football. I loved it. I love the physicality. I love the hard work that it takes to achieve anything that you try to do in a sport or an activity. And, I bought the business in 1990. Hey, I was a smoker until 1987. I smoked Marlboro Lights, if I remember right. And, when I quit, I stopped going to the bars. It went hand in hand, right? Beer, smoke. So, when I decided to stop smoking, I had to stop drinking. So I didn't go out with all my buddies that I had made. And that was a tough thing for me. But it was the right thing for me. It's the best thing I ever did was quit smoking. I mean, how many years is that? 23 and 13. That's 36 years ago. And so we bought the business in 1990. I didn't do anything but work, Chris, for 10 years. I didn't do anything physical. I didn't do anything in the gym. I tried to run, and then I quit because, like anything, you don't feel good about any activity unless you stick with it. And so in 2000, I went into Planet Fitness. I saw your father in there, and we just got going. And I told him why I was back in there, because the business was just killing me. And that's when I started hiking with him. It was the best thing ever happened to me, hiking with your dad.
Yeah,
your dad is great.
You were in your early 40s at that time, roughly speaking?
No. We bought the business in. Oh yeah, that's right, Chris. You're
20,
right.
20.
I'm thinking about when I bought the restaurant.
No. In 2000, when you started hiking, right? If I'm doing the math,
I was 43.
You were in your early 40s. So you're in your early 40s, and you're looking for something active to do to sort of to nurture that physical part of you. I mean, there had to have been sort of health motivations too, right? To try to be as fit and healthy as you could possibly be.
That was I yearned for physicality. I don't mind huffing and puffing. You know that from when I did that. What was it? The
wild man biathlon.
No. When I did that thing at your house there with the bicycle, what was I doing? The heart rate.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and you couldn't believe it when I was doing like 170, and I sustained it for like, I don't know how many minutes. But,
That's right.
But that's me. I mean, that's what I like. That's what I thirst for, that. And so the physicality of almost anything, like, just doesn't bother me. I mean, it hurts. It hurts sometimes, but it's what I like. So I got to tell you this, though, Chris. I did a little studying today just before we got on.
Right.
My first 5 years of hiking, I did 65 hikes in 5 years, 132 peaks. The second 5 years, so now we're up to 10, right? But the second 5, I did 78 hikes and 124 peaks. So just about the same, right? Very close. Take a look at the next 5 years. I did, okay, let's not get lost here. Oh, no. Okay, so the third 5 years, so year 10 to 15.
Yep.
I did 76 hikes. Now, I didn't count out how many peaks I did, but look at this. The fourth, so year 15 to 20, which I've been hiking now, 23 years.
Right.
I did 345 hikes. Okay. Now, thinking about that, okay, I count my hikes like, there's a lot of I'll do multiple hikes in the same day. I count them as individual hikes. Mm-hmm. The only ones like, if I do 4 peaks in one hike, that's one hike. But like Womback and Cabot, that's 2 separate hikes. So I count that as 2. And so the 500 kind of gets into that, but 345 hikes. So from year 2020 to now, I've already done 268 hikes.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about the acceleration here, right?
Right.
But to your point, quite an extraordinary level of consistency in that first decade, and that's kind of where I want to focus here for a few minutes. And I want to talk about that first decade from really the first 15 years or so, and how you sort of relatively quickly went from day hiking in the whites to standing atop some of the highest peaks in the world. I want to talk about that. Before we do that, though, let me quickly circle back for the listener, as I want the listener to understand how you and I know each other. So as I was thinking about that, I think it's probably safe to say that we have known each other for almost the entirety of my life, at least since I was a little kid. And it's likely you knew me before I knew you, meaning this. You mentioned that you played football at Dover High School. My dad, Jim, coached there. My dad coached you specifically. As a kid, I would tag along at football practice. And so while I didn't necessarily know all the players by name, you undoubtedly, as a player, would have recognized the Dunn boys running around at practice. So you probably knew who I was,
Chris,
before I actually had a
I'm
chance
going to
to
interrupt
meet
you. Chris, okay. I coached with your father. So that meant I had meetings at your house. And I saw you and Jay at your house when you guys were wicked young. Okay. So, I remember you too. I remember this too. I remember your brother Jay. I coached him at Little Green, and that little rascal at the time, you put a helmet on him and his eyes just went like he was like, what's the next thing I'm going to hit? I mean, and then obviously you were at high school at that time, and, I was coaching at the junior high level. So I was connected and watched you play football and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of connection there between myself and your family. No question about it.
Yeah, no doubt. We go back a very, very long time.
I look at your father like a big uncle to me.
Yeah, well,
he's like family to me.
Yeah, and I mean, interestingly enough, you and I both had the opportunity to play for him.
Yep.
And interestingly enough, both myself and my dad actually had the unique opportunity to coach you. You and I worked together briefly in a coach-athlete role a number of years ago. Of course, as I mentioned before, you had the opportunity to play for my dad. So anyway, suffice to say, for the listener to understand that our history goes back 40 plus years. We've known each other for a very, very long time. So you mentioned my father as being as being a mentor, sort of, generally a life mentor, if you will. But Ken, who were some of your other early hiking mentors?
Oh my God, I don't have any.
Really? So my dad was.
Your dad was everything. I mean, we hiked together for a long time, and he taught me so much about how. And I try to tell people the right and wrong way to hike the White Mountains, and also, when there was tragedies, no matter where they were in the world, in the Whites, anywhere else, your father and I would hike, and that's all we talk about was the tragedy, and try to reason it out, what we should have done, what we could have done. And that's why this problem I had when I got disoriented in the Whites and ended up at the Zealand Hut, all that came back to me. Like, you have to, all those things that Jim said you had to think about. And I did make mistakes. But a lot of that came back, and it's because I had experience about, studying it. It wasn't just, okay, you got to do this and that. We really studied the ramifications about just about any decision that you make in the mountain.
Ken, in March of 2006, you started mountaineering, which you did for approximately a decade. Your first mountaineering trip was to the summit of the 14,411 foot Mount Rainier in Washington State. For the listener, we sort of throw around the terms hiking and mountaineering, and there is a distinction with a difference. For the listener, can you give the listener your thoughts about the difference between hiking and mountaineering?
Well, just so the listener understands, I have no experience doing extensive rock climbing or ice climbing or anything like that. So when we're talking about mountaineering, we're talking about glacial travel versus, and also, like Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua aren't really considered glacial. But it's still mountaineering because you're at such a high altitude. So the difference really is, well, there's a lot. Actually, there's a lot of differences.
Yeah. Well, let me phrase it a little bit more precisely for you, from a technical standpoint, from a technique standpoint. What are some of the more advanced mountaineering or climbing techniques that you needed to learn in order to take the step up from hiking in the Whites to hiking Mount Rainier, for instance?
Oh God, there's so much stuff. Oh,
yeah, well, just give us a couple of examples of some.
Well, first of all, you got to learn to rope in, because you're roped up as a team.
Okay, so use of ropes, climbing ropes and climbing harnesses.
Where in the White Mountains, there's no need of ropes.
Okay,
for the most part, and so people that hike just exclusively in the Adirondacks, or up in Maine and Baxter, or typically most of the time. I mean, I'm sure that's why I said about ice climbing and rock climbing. There could be ropes involved with that, obviously. But typically when you're hiking, your typical 48, you don't need to be roped up. Rest step is huge. I still do that today at the White Mountains. That helps you not burn your legs. And, you might be a little slower than the average, if you will, New England hiker. But at the end of the day, my legs are going to be in better shape than maybe someone that just trying to plow through an 8 or 10 or 12 mile hike. So particularly a lot of that is in the winter with snowshoes and so on and so forth. And breathing is huge. There's a certain style of breathing that helps you climb at elevation, and it's all a big lesson. And until you do it, you're just never going to understand it until you go to a place like Rainier, which would be a good training ground for high altitude climbing.
Yeah. And what about a technique like self-arresting? Is that a technique that you needed, a skill that you needed to acquire as you look to take on some of these higher elevation peaks?
Well, if you did a 5-day glacial training with in my case it was RMI, which is Rainier Mountaineering. They teach you all of that. They teach you how to rope up, how you're supposed to be a team in ropes, how to self-arrest, how to breathe, how to rest step, talk about diamox, all kinds of things to help you get through the, because I'll tell you, one of the things I've learned in my climbing is that even the guides don't feel good. I mean, at altitude's tough. It's tough on everybody.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, particularly about your experiences in Ecuador around acute mountain sickness. So suffice to say, from a technical standpoint, there's a significant difference in some of the techniques and skills associated with mountaineering versus hiking. And you also make the point too that there are clinics, mountaineering clinics that are held that allow you the ability to gain and gather those skills.
But Chris, is one big thing we didn't talk about is a huge difference in equipment.
Yeah, well, actually, that was going to be part two of my more precise question. Correct. So yeah, and again, just briefly from an equipment standpoint, Ken, what are some of the more obvious differences in equipment hiking, day hiking versus mountaineering? Like what are you carrying on your person when you're mountaineering that you might not if you're day hiking in the whites?
Well, for me anyway, I mean, I think this is pretty much true for everybody. I mean, I have what they call a rigid mountaineering boot, plastic boot, where, in the whites, I just wear a leather insulated boot. Can't get away with that at elevation. You need to have a rigid boot so that you can. I use step-in crampons. People don't realize, from hiking in the whites, most of the time when you're on big mountains, you're in crampons. You don't do snowshoes. Snowshoes were off at Denali at 11,000 feet. From 11,000 feet to the summit, you were in crampons the whole way. The same with Aconcagua, Elborez. I don't even think I brought snowshoes with me on the plane. So yeah, it's Chris. High altitude climbing is a huge learning curve. It was for me anyway. And maybe it isn't for certain people, but for me it was a huge learning experience. But one that I enjoyed thoroughly.
Yeah.
Good and bad. I mean, I've had some bad experiences on big mountains.
So I want to get into this this 9 or so year period in which you were mountaineering. But let me quickly double back and ask you this: what inspired you to take up mountaineering? What inspired you to sort of take that leap and make that jump from hiking up to mountaineering? What was the inspiration?
Your father. I mean, he'd been out with Keating to Mount Rainier, and he discussed the challenges that they went through. I think, if I remember right, your dad would know better, but I think I had just started hiking, and Jim and Keating, that this is a good friend of your dad's, had just come back from Mount Rainier. So that had been around 2000, somewhere in there. And, the stories and stuff just got me going and stuff. And, your brother Jay was involved with still climbing at the time. And your dad and I first went out to Whitney, actually. We went out to Mount Whitney and climbed there. And that, you want to talk about me being sick. I have never been. Yeah, you can say I was sick in Ecuador. I was never more sick than I was at Whitney. Whitney was bad. I was really sick with altitude sickness. And but then, it turned around. Jay wanted to do Ecuador. Jim wanted the challenge. I started to tag along, but obviously before I could do that, I had to get the glacial training, which I did at Mount Rainier. So that was the stepping ground for everything after that.
Yeah. So then just 2 short years later, you went from climbing Rainier to climbing Cotopaxi in Ecuador, Cotopaxi at just over 19,000 feet. This was July of 2008. You talked about Whitney being a really challenging experience from an altitude sickness standpoint. But altitude sickness dogged you a little bit in Ecuador as well.
Oh yeah.
How did you? What was that like, and how did you deal with that in Ecuador?
All right. So Ecuador, the interesting thing about Ecuador is we did some acclimatizing hikes, which were fine. I felt some effects of the altitude, which, most of it's breathing and so on and so forth. I mean, it changes. I mean, your breathing mechanism it's different. And I did okay. If I remember well, with the acclimatizing hikes, I think they're around 14,000 or 15,000 feet. But then the thing about Cotopaxi, you drove up in a bus with all your equipment in bags at 14.4, I think it was, something like that. So they drop you off at a bus about 2,000 feet or 2,500 feet below the glacier in a parking lot, which is kind of, when you think of big mountains, that's kind of, you just don't expect that. So we hiked from 14.4 to the cabin at 15.2 or 5. I can't remember exactly. And going along, no problem. I get to the hut within 20 or 30 minutes after I got to the hut. Oh my God, I am not doing well. I am not doing well at all. I am feeling like crap. And next thing I know, I'm sick to my stomach. And it was another learning experience for me. But one thing I learned in Ecuador that was valuable for the rest of my high altitude climbing is that if given enough time, you can get through altitude effects if you're not feeling well. You just have to do the right things. And I'll give you an example. Cotopaxi is an example. I went to my lead guide, Mike Walter, who is just an amazing guide and climber. I said, Mike, I'm feeling, Chris, you have to understand, I was really sick. I mean, really, really sick. I said, Mike, what am I going to do? I mean, we're going up tomorrow. He said, Kenny, bring your water bottle and your sleeping bag with you and just keep sipping water. And that's what I did. He said, don't drink a lot of water at one time. He said, just keep sipping it. Whenever you get a chance, keep sipping water. And that's what I did. And I'm going to tell you, and your father will tell you this, and Jay will tell you this. There was a gentleman, I can't remember his name. I think his name was Dave. He was from Seattle, Washington. Of course, they climb bigger mountains out there than we have out here in the East Coast. And he was the strongest hiker all the way through. Well, I was the strongest hiker on Summit Day. And so but the reason I say that is he didn't feel well on Summit Day. He was strong all the way through when I was sick. And then he didn't feel well. Not that he was sick to his stomach, because he wasn't. But he didn't feel right. And I felt great. So like my point being is, you just have to persevere, stay focused, stay within the game, and nothing is more important than experience at altitude, in my opinion. I mean, you can sit there and you can tell everybody, keep drinking water. You got to be able to sleep at night, eat what you can, and so on and so forth. You know what? Until you felt altitude sickness and stuff, and everybody can get it, you got to learn how to get through it. And boy, I've had plenty of opportunities to do that.
Experience is the greatest teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a wonderful picture of you and my brother Jay and my dad.
Great picture.
Standing on the top of Cotopaxi. Ken, what do you remember about that summit day? What do you remember about standing on the summit with?
I think
those
Jay and your father were not doing that great, and I think your father was not doing well at all. But your dad always has this. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. He always has this positive or slinky way of, kind of diverting his problem. And he did the same thing that day. But I can tell you, he was low on energy. Your dad has always had very low body fat. And, when you're hiking those big mountains, I've hiked 2 mountains. I've lost 13 pounds. Your father can't do that because he has no body fat to lose 13 pounds. So if he does lose 8, 9 pounds, boy, that's really, as you know, physically, that is going to take a toll. And I think that's what affected your dad that day But you know what? He did it, and that's all that matters. Yeah, he was able to see that most beautiful summit I've ever been on. I mean, I've been on some beautiful summits. They're all beautiful. Yeah, but I can tell you, Cotopaxi is the most beautiful summit I have ever been on. And I was blessed to stand there and be arm in arm with your brother Jay and Jim, my mentor, and hiking. I'll never forget that my whole life.
It's it's a pretty cool photo. My dad has that photo in his TV room, very, very prominently displayed.
Yeah.
Well, that was 2008. Ken, in a span of over the next 6 years, specifically from 2010 to 2014, you climbed 4 of the 7 summits: Kilimanjaro, Denali, Aconcagua, and Elbrus. Ken, was the original plan to climb all 7 of the 7 summits?
I don't think so. I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I didn't want to do all 7 summits, but the financial piece, I mean, it wasn't financially doable. And I kind of knew that. But for me, I just took the next summit. And I still do that today. Whether it's the New Hampshire 500, the New England 100 highest, I just focus on what's tomorrow's summit I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So like for me, it was one after another. It seemed right for me. I did. Many people contacted me and said you should try to get some sponsors and go to Everest and stuff. And Chris, I'm not a salesman. I can't do that stuff. And I didn't feel right about taking other people's money to go get my challenge. It didn't seem right to me. But I'll say this: when I got done in Peru, I knew that I was ready to do just about anything. I could challenge myself to just about anything at high altitude. I felt like I had it totally figured out. And I'll say this to your listeners: one of the big things I made a mistake on at high altitude is I drink coffee. Right? So I've had problems with acute mountain sickness. So my stomach was always an issue. So I would never drink much coffee at altitude. Well, the problem is my body wants caffeine. When I deprived it, I got the headaches.
Right.
So
Right.
I didn't know that. And then finally, I can't remember what mountain it was on, Elbrus or something. And they said, that's why you're getting a headache. So I started drinking coffee with hot chocolate, mochas, unbelievable. I never had another problem. I was fired up.
I think that I think sometimes people mistakenly feel, or some people mistakenly understand caffeine as a much more powerful diuretic than it actually is. It's really not. Caffeine truly is not that powerful of a diuretic, meaning that there's really no physiologic reason to withhold caffeine intake if you on days that you're climbing high. If you are accustomed to drinking coffee, obviously you don't want to start drinking coffee, the first day you go to high altitude. But if caffeine consumption is part of your normal routine, it's always best, I think, to stick with your normal routine.
Well, I didn't. And that's why I got the headaches.
Yeah.
And after that, I didn't have headaches.
So just again for the listener, the order that you climbed these 4 the highest summits was: you did Kilimanjaro in 2010, you did Denali in 2011. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. You did Aconcagua in 2013, and then Elbrus in 2014. First question about those. Second question about those 4 7 summits. Aconcagua it was the tallest, or it is the tallest of those 4, at just under 23,000 feet, 22,838 feet. But was Aconcagua the most difficult of the 4?
Oh no.
No. Okay. All right. Don't tell me which of the 4. Let's talk about that. So that's interesting to me too. That the tallest was not necessarily the most difficult. Here's what I want to focus on, because I think there's a really good story in here. Let's talk about Denali, Ken. In our pre-show interview, we went over this climbing resume, if you will, and you said to me, when we were talking about these 4 of the 7 summits, you said Denali 2011. You said research the incident. Okay, so you said that's what you said. So I spent a little time, and I actually I looked up the sort of after action reports from Denali. It's not what they're called. They're actually technically called. These are incident reports. Yeah. That are filed by the National Park Service. Right. Denali being in a national park, when there are incidents on Denali, there's an official sort of government process that happens in which detailed reports are taken about the incident. So interestingly enough, and I want you to talk about this, May 2011 on Denali. Now, I should say for the listener, so that the listener knows, your summit day was May 25th. So you were a little bit later in May. But here's what happened on Denali in May of 2011. May 1st, one climber was killed. A female climber was killed in an avalanche. May 13th, one climber was killed. Cause of death, undetermined, but likely to be related to exposure. May 17th, one climber was killed in a fall. Climber fell about 1,000 feet. You were there May 25th. May 26th, two climbers were killed in an avalanche. And then on May 27th, 2 climbers were killed as a result of a fall. That was 7 deaths on Denali in just the month of May. Now you can talk about this, but the climbing season in Denali starts, I think, in April and certainly goes through May. That was an incredibly dangerous month on Denali. Ken, talk about your experience on Denali. Did you know about those other incidences prior to your arrival in Denali? If so, were there any special precautions taken? What was that like to be on Denali in Alaska in that particular month, in that very specific year?
I got to tell you, I mean, Denali was like, everybody will tell you that climb mountains and climb at altitude, Denali's got to be one of the top ones to achieve. And there's no question that when I started climbing at altitude, that was going to be my focus. And I reached out to you to get physically fit, did some training with you, and which was very helpful. But, when you sign the paper to go, you never think at all that you won't come home or somebody else won't come home. Never entered my mind. So when we immediately almost, I was with an RMI group, Rainier Mountaineering again. They had, I want to think they had 8 groups on Denali that season. We were the first group, so it was May 5th. So that was about the earliest you can get on the mountain in Denali because of the winter. And right away, we'd heard of people getting in trouble. But what really happened was we had a perfect series of, our approach to the mountain, to the summit. You cache high, sleep low, and we continued to do that until we got to 16.2 and then slept at 14.2. We cached at 16.2, excuse me, and we slept at 14.2. Everything went perfect, and then all of a sudden, everything hit the fan. Denali winter was moving out, and Denali spring, because they don't have a summer, moves in. And what happened that year was that it was all about the wind. The wind moves the winter out and the spring in. But in this case, in 2011, the winds were horrific. Absolutely horrific. Hurricane force winds, 90-mile-an-hour winds. The temperatures were minus incredibly low. Okay, probably, I'm going to guesstimate, but probably minus 45, minus 50 degrees. So some of the incidences you talked about, Chris, were really bad luck. I think one of them, the first one, was an ice climbing incident, and they were hit by a piece of ice. I think you said an avalanche, but I thought on the mountain when I was there that they got hit with ice. And that's look, when you climb big mountains, or in their case, I think it was on Mount Hunter. They were ice climbing, and there's a risk involved. Okay. And unfortunately, they sacrificed everything on that one, which is sad. So, we started hearing about incidences right away. But our first, I want to think, I'm going to guess, Chris, 4 to 6 days, we had no incidences at all. We get to 14,000 feet. We cache at 16. We come down. All of a sudden, if you will, the shit hits the fan. I mean, literally. The winds start kicking up. Our lead guy, Mike Walter, says, I can see the blocks, the snow. At 17,000-foot camp, you're building your walls with glacial ice. You take a saw out, a glacial saw, and you saw blocks out and to protect your tent site. Well, Mike Walter is saying, I can see the blocks being blown off at 17,000 foot. Now, it's crystal clear out. There's no clouds. None. I don't feel an ounce of wind at 14,000 feet. But at 17,000 feet, it's a freaking hurricane. It's incredible. And I couldn't see, because I'm a rookie. I've never been there before, so I didn't know right where to look. But Mike knew right where to look, and he says, I can see the snow blocks being blown off the mountain. There's people up there. Are you kidding me? I mean, I'll never forget when we came back down on a little trek to acclimatize in the bowl, where a very safe position we were at 14,000 feet. People had just got down from 17,000 feet from that nightmare. I will never forget a woman's face with 2 other people that were kneeling. They were just kneeling there, motionless. But you should have seen the horror on their face. Their face were totally red. I mean, I'll never forget it. These things it's stamped in your head. And it didn't end there. It just got worse and worse and worse. We heard helicopters. They had the highest rescue attempt in Denali history while we were there at 19,000 feet, Denali Pass, which is the most dangerous spot on Denali to the trek to the summit. And, all we heard for 2 weeks was helicopters, because I was on the mountain for 26 days, and the average, I think, is 17 days to summit and come off the mountain. So we were there. We were there the second longest in the history of RMI treks to get to the summit. We were blessed to achieve it, but we saw a lot of tragedy along the way. And
now
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I thought you mentioned that you thought that you may have crossed paths or met some of the climbers that were involved in some of these incidents. Was that true?
Yes, there was an Italian group, and which was really pathetic. These three Italians, and I believe me, they were just from Italy. Okay, folks, I'm not bad about Italian people, but they were Italian, and there was a Japanese group that they loved to film and take pictures and stuff. They were filming these three Italians, and the Italians were really headstrong about trying to get up to the summit as fast as possible. And they used, Chris, you can help me with this. I may stumble on this one, but like a rope you'd find on a farm, like it's made with just, it's not like a mountaineering rope. It wasn't a mountaineering rope at all.
Yeah.
And they got it around their waist, climbing up. There's no possibility of safety. And Mike Walter, I'll never forget what he said to me. Well, not me. He said to all of us, he said, those three are going to get us all dead. Because the thing is, people don't realize, we sit at home at sea level and we talk about this stuff. It's totally different at elevation. And he said, we're going to have to help these people because they're a mess. They have no clue. And what happened there was those guys went up to the summit way too early. This guy was 67 years old, the Italian gentleman, and he got delirious from altitude. So the other two said, hey, go back down. Yeah, go back down, Autobahn, which you can't go down without being tethered in and so on and so forth as far as roping in. You can't rope in by yourself. You need a team. So he fell 1,500 feet to his death, which is just horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually reading the incident report now. That he the incident report says at the time he fell, the gentleman was beginning the traverse from Denali Pass to the 17,200 foot camp along a 45-degree slope of hard, wind-blown snowpack.
Correct.
He was traveling ahead of his two teammates and was unroped at the time of the fall.
Right.
Interestingly enough, you made this point earlier, weather at the time of the accident was clear with relatively calm winds.
Correct. But the thing is, Chris, they had acute mountain sickness. The guy was almost delirious. The other two, that the thing that they're not talking about, and that we knew because we were there, and word gets around the camps, right? Those two kept going up to the summit, the other two, and they let him turn around on his own. And that's why he fell down that 1,500 feet, because he had no support.
I mean, with all this tragedy happening around you, obviously you're. I mean, not only were you as a climber kind of beginning to sort of hear the chatter about this, but clearly your guides were well aware of what was happening on the mountain. Was there ever any discussion that you recall during that time to abort or abandon the expedition, just out of fear of safety?
Absolutely not, because I'll tell you why. We felt confident that our guides were going to keep us in a safe situation. And I have never, ever felt anything different than that. I say that today. I felt it then. And, I think I said this earlier. When you sign the papers to go to a trek like Denali and try to achieve the goal, you never expect to see dead bodies. And I certainly didn't, but boy, was that an eye-opener for me. And we had, on summit day, we summited, and it's this last group that you'll see in your incident report. We were on our way down, and a female guide with 3 male clients was going up to the summit. And we were sitting down taking a break. We were exhausted. It was a long day. It was a great place to take a break. We were drinking water, having a little bit of food. And they were coming up. And she said, "Hey, did you guys summit?" And we said, "Yep." She said, "Congratulations," and all this stuff. And when we got up to leave and they went by us, we took each other's poles and we hit each other's poles like a clapping type of thing, and congratulations. Well, I got down. I was a mess. I mean, I was 20 years older than anybody else, and I just went in my tent. I just needed to crash. And the next morning, Mike unzips our tent, goes, "I hate to say this, but we've had another tragedy this morning." And that group that was very cordial to us, very congratulative to us about our summit, the guide and one of the clients, they had all fallen down the 1,500-foot Autobahn, and she passed away, and so did one of the clients. We got out of the tent. You could see the 2 bodies at the bottom of the Autobahn. I mean, I wasn't that close, so like you could see the specks, against the snow, and I just dropped to my knees and bawled my eyes out.
Did that experience cause you to pause and think about, what it was that you were doing and whether or not it was worth it in the end?
Oh no, I mean, that piece never happened to me. But I will say this. I think it makes you realize how important it is to follow as much protocol, if you will, and etiquette on a mountain as you should. You need to respect everything about the mountain, because even in the best scenario, something can happen and you could be gone. And I'd love to talk to you about my Peru experience, where that's really the only summit I didn't achieve, and I'm the one that turned it around.
Yeah, that's a good place for us to pause on part 1 of this two-part podcast. Let's pause there, and then we'll pick back up in the next episode. Let's talk about that in the next episode. Let's talk about that Peru trip in 2016.
Yep.
Your last expedition, high altitude expedition, and then you certainly, as we will learn, you certainly kept yourself busy after that Peru trip. And we'll talk about this project called The Grid that you were involved with, and then we'll finish part 2 with the discussion about your latest passion, bushwhacking. We'll get into some of the technical elements and features of bushwhacking. Ken, thank you very much for this discussion, this part 1. I look forward to doing part 2.
Awesome, Chris. Thanks so much.
Boy, you could really hear the emotion in his voice when he recounted the story of that recent close call in the Whites. It really does emphasize his point that when bushwhacking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the wintertime, the margin for error is 0. Tune in next week for part 2 of my conversation with Ken. We'll cover his epic expedition to Peru in 2016, something called The Grid, and his latest passion, bushwhacking. Once again, you've been listening to the Eat Half, Walk Double podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please circle back to the homepage and click the follow or subscribe button to stay up to date with all the new content. And of course, if you really enjoyed the show, please consider sharing it with your friends. I'll be posting some supporting media on my Twitter account at Coach Chris J. Dunn and the show's Facebook page at Eat Half, Walk Double, so make sure to check that out. And lastly, remember, the secret to living well and longer is to eat half, walk double, laugh triple, and love without measure. Until next time.